Turns up on. How's everybody this morning? Hi. I'm in New Orleans this morning. How are you guys? Hey, RJ. How's it going? Everybody good? We got a good group. Hey, Michael. Got our lucky 13 this morning. That's how many participants we have, if it doesn't show you that.
Now can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Excellent.
Hey, how are you?
Very normal.
Good. That's good. Normal's good, right? That's what we're all trying to achieve.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay.
You trapped there. Sometimes I think people are hearing me and I'm muted, and I think that I've got everything working, but you know how that is.
Yeah, we can hear you.
There he is. Hey, Vincent, how are you? I got a new Ring doorbell yesterday and hooked it up, and it messed up the ring on the other side of the house. So gonna get the internet updated over the weekend, so I'm worried about that. Any sort of change bad. But we have to have change. That's what our field survives from. I'm gonna turn this off and look at our code that we were doing last time. We stopped this. Whoops. I always try to do that. I have to move it out of the way. Then I can still see the chat. Okay. So we were looking at array processing last time, and we wrote a little bit of code where we created an array of ages, which were just numbers, just integers. And then we printed out our list, really is the correct term in Python. And then we printed individual items within our list by using index values. So we have some different things going on there. Whenever we start working with arrays, our syntax just seems like it can get really, I don't know, more complicated than it was before. And it made me start thinking about our Word document that we started early on with our Python syntax. I'm going to open that. Our Python quick reference. Do you have that?
Can you share your screen?
Yeah, that would help. Thank you. Do you have 57 messages over here that I haven't looked at? Share, share. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it.
There it is. It's being slow. See, there's something going on with my network. I hope it's not worse before it gets better. All right, so I've got this old quick reference document that we were working on, and I just hate doing it in Word, don't you? I mean, it just seems like it just messes up our syntax so bad. I've looked around, and I don't know what the best thing for us to use is. So we can keep using Word until we find something better. But we could turn off the autocorrect features in Word so that it didn't automatically capitalize the first letter of each line. But if we do that, that's an option that impacts all of our Word documents. And so I don't really want to, make that change globally to Word. So we'll just keep battling with it a little bit. But I kind of wanted to go a little further here and taking a look at our document. We started out with our basic syntax, and of course printing out stuff was the first thing we did when we were working with Python. And then we put in information about how to declare variables and give them values, and our basic definition of a function and how to call a function, and then how to use the input built-in function. And then we went to our if statements. So I think that's all good for our basic syntax. But right here where we start with our while, I think maybe this would be a good place to split this off. So I think I'm going to come down below the table and just go to a new page. I'll just press enter to go to a new page. And I'm zoomed in, so it looks like that's really far, but it's not really as far as it looked. I wanted to make it a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to add a new table. In the table we were using, we just had 2 columns. Gosh, when we insert this table, it's almost just like an array, huh? We could insert, all of these values here, and that would be a whole array of table rows. We want them to be 2 entries across, so I'll select the 2, and I'll just grab as many as I can. So I'm making a 2-dimensional array, correct? And I could do that with Python. We'll look at that a little bit later today. So I would like to move my while statement down into this new table. So I'm going to select that row and Control X to cut it. Move my table to the new page, and then Control V to paste it. And that's because I thought, well, we'll just put all of our more advanced syntax in this next table. We have some basic stuff in that first one, but it's getting hard to see things. So I'm going to skip a row and look at a for loop. We know, if you remember, there are lots of different formats we can use for for loops in Python. And then there's that format that our textbook uses that's more like C# and Java. So the for loops can get a little complicated because we have so many different options. So we started out saying that if we wanted to run a for loop a certain number of times, we could say for a certain variable in a range. And then within parentheses, we could specify that range. So like if we just gave it the number 10, then it would run 10 times. I'm going to replace that F with a lowercase f. So how could we use some highlighting here in Word to help us really dissect this for statement? First of all, the for and in are required keywords. So the things that we could change, range is a required keyword for this syntax also. The things that we could change are the variable name. So I'm going to highlight that. And then we could change the range. So I'm going to highlight that. And then over here in the other half of our column, I'm going to put something like var equals variable name to use in the loop. Not var var. And I'm going to make that all green. And then I'm going to say 10 equals times to execute the loop. And let's highlight that and make it blue. Now, different people are going to need to focus on different aspects of this for loop. There are things that are clear to some people that are just, like muddy as can be to someone else. So think about the things that are questions to you. What are you wondering about? And make some notes about those kinds of things. So we wanted to keep our notes up to date. Sometimes it's hard to remember when we're in the excitement of coding to come back here and update. Now we could add more syntax in for our for loop. So we could say for item in list, right? And if we use this syntax, then item is going to be the variable name that we're using within our loop body. And list is going to be the controlling item. One thing list. Can you hear my motorcycle racers out there? We're not on that busy of a road, but boy, sometimes it is. And it sounds like everybody's pretty much decided in Springfield they can go places and do things because they sure are out there. Now, list is going to be equal to, we have seen so many different things used here. We have seen, first of all, it could be a string, which is an array of letters, right? So it could be like the word Python. And we saw that we ran a for loop like this when we used the word Python. Item would end up being each letter, and we could print out each letter in the word Python. Or we could use an array like the arrays we're creating, like our age array, and then we could run our for loop for each age in our age array. So list can be a collection of items that we want to process. And I'll highlight that in blue just to kind of match. Okay, so again, we've seen a lot of different ways that we can set these things up. We saw in our range, we can use just one number like this, and then the loop will start setting var equal to 0, and then it will run setting var equal to 1 and var equal to 2, all the way up to 9. It will stop when it gets to 10 because it has hit that condition. We could set up within the parentheses our beginning number, our number of iterations like the 10, and our increment. So we've seen a lot of different ways we could do that. I'll add that. We could say 1, 0, 10, 1, and that would be the exact same thing because we're saying start at 0, end at 10, increment by 1. Okay, as we put stuff in this document, making things worse, things better, don't want to do it, just want to do some code. What are you thinking? I can't see you. Can't see it through your black squares. The reason I wanted to do this is because of the array focus. Okay, thank you, Chelsea. To me it is, but sometimes I have to break things down and other people are like, what is your problem? Because I think that it's important for us to really focus on the individual pieces, right? Because we're putting all this code together and sometimes it can seem kind of magical, and it's not. It's just like putting a sentence together. We just have to use the pieces that we are allowed. Okay, so those are kind of our looping constructs that we've seen. So let's go down and create a new table. I'm going to go to the end of this one. Let's take a look, Isaiah. That's a good question. If you can't see the chat, Isaiah's asking if range can take non-integers. Look, there's a Google search for us with Python range using float numbers. So very good question. It says the main limit of Python's range is it works only with integers. Okay, so we have a special library, PyNative, is that what it is? They're trying to implement using a float. So remember, that's the cool thing about Python. When you get more experienced as a coder, you can actually submit code to update Python's capabilities. So we could do something like that. Well, 0 through 10 yields 10 numbers, right? Because it runs 10 times. Let's think about it. I'm going to go right here at the edge and press enter to add a new row right after that. You could right click and insert row. But if we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, that's 10 numbers because 0 counts, right? So as developers, yeah, there it is. If we added 10, that would give us 11 numbers. As developers, we have to remember that 0 counts, and it can be a hard thing. But that gives us 10. Makes sense? And
Yeah.
the reason that they don't use 10 is basically to our thinking, it's a less than condition. So we're going to execute this loop while our increment variable is less than this number. So what would happen if we started with the number 1? It would still stop when it got to 10. So then we would only execute our loop 9 times, right? So is it counting 10 times or getting to the number 10? It's getting to the number 10. So it's not counting 10 up from the variable value. It's counting from the variable value until it gets to 10. Does that make sense? Really good question. Somewhat, yes, and you could start at negative numbers. We can do a lot with that. We'll try it. If we go to the Python, just bring up your Python interpreter. We can do some experimenting. So we could say for x in range 10, print. Oops, bad me. If you press the up arrow on your keyboard, it will show you the last thing you typed. Yes. Count every integer less than the second variable and greater than or equal to the first variable. Yes. Now I'm going to try this again. I'm going to press tab and print x. And then when I press enter again to make it execute my code, we can see x starts at 0 and ends at 9. So let's try some of the things that you're asking about. What if we start at 2 and go to 10? It still stops at 9, right? So we're just giving it a starting position. If we start at -2, then it's going to execute more than 10 times, right? Exactly. Thanks, Vincent. Start and increment. So we still have to control what's going on, but we have all the different capabilities. Yeah, it is hard to remember that it stops at 1 less. It's hard to remember for me because that is something that's just unique to Python. And so if we can just always think of that ending number as, you know, this is the stopping point. When it gets to this number, this is the stopping point. So it does not continue when it gets to that number. Good. I think that's good practice. So I was thinking about it this morning, and I think that it's important for us to kind of summarize these things and clarify, because working with arrays gives us a lot of power, and we want to make sure we know how to harness that power. Because we have to use a lot of loops when we're working with arrays, because the very nature of an array is that it's a repeating structure. Okay, so I'm going to insert a little bit more of a table here. And I want to think about, we saw that if we did array name equals the square brackets, that would create an empty array named array name. So we can highlight that array name if you like. Try to think of our important points here. And then our square brackets are what really indicate that it is a variable with repeating values. Okay, so those brackets. Now I could create a two-dimensional array with rows and columns. Oops. By putting a comma in between those square brackets. So this would create an empty two-dimensional array named array 2D. So it would have rows and columns. Okay. Now if we want to add something to our array, we saw, sorry, my cursor's going everywhere. We saw that we could use a special built-in function that works with arrays. I'm going to bring up our code called Append. So this will add the data to the array. A new entry, right? New entry in our array. So let's split that up. First of all, our array name has to be a variable that we've already told Python is an array. The append is a keyword. So we have to use that exact term. And then our data is something that we've decided. So let's document that. Data could be a variable, it could be a string or a number, anything that we wanted to add into our array. So data is a variable, string, number, anything. Add a little bit more here. And then I want to really document append is, whoops, I'm getting too much highlighting going here. So the keyword append is, see if I can stop highlighting here. So append is the name of the array function that adds an entry to an array. Say it 57 ways, right? But that name is required. That's a built-in function. It's from the system. So we have to use that word append. And then the data is what we're adding. Okay, so let's look at our code there where we had that. And you can see what we did is we prompted our user for input and we saved their input in our user data variable. And then we used our user data variable to append to our array named scores. So that's pretty handy. But now there's some other things that we saw too with arrays. I'm going to come back up here. Nah, I'll keep going. I don't want to get it too busy. I could say array name equals so Jose, and that would set up an array for me. So yellow, our array name, and then the contents of our array. I made those kind of green before. That's not what I want. I want the highlighter. There we go. So this creates an array. Turn it off later. Okay, well, so when I'm looking at these 3 entries, remember, oh, stop it. That's why I hate using Word to do these kinds of things. It's just like, I think that you still want that. Okay, so creates an array with 3 entries. Now the index values for those 3 entries are 0, 1, and 2. So that would be valid index values. So if I refer to an array and then I add some sort of index value within square brackets after the name of the array, make that green. I am referring to the item index location 2 within the array. So just an address, a pointer into our array. So that would be 0, 1, 2. That would be Jose, our last entry. So anytime I want to refer to that entry, whether I'm going to change it or read it, I can refer to it that way. Now this append function is just one of many functions that are available when we're working with an array. One thing that's nice about Atom is that, and even any sort of editor, even idle a little bit, is that it will try to help us with some intelligent help, know about some of those functions. So in our example here, we've got a couple of different things going on. In our first code snippet that's not commented out, we have an array of scores. We ask for 5 different scores, and we use the value of k, our range variable, to annotate our message. So we ask for score 0, score 1, score 2, right? And then we take the data that the user gave us and add it to our scores array, and then we print out the scores array. Next, in our monthly sales option here, we actually at the end of class created a separate array that contains a shortened version of the month name for the first 4 months of the year. So this application would not work if we were wanting to do a higher number of months, but we controlled our loop to only ask for 4 months. We set up another array, a sales array, to be empty. And then we go into a for loop, again using a variable k is our variable control, and we only want to execute this loop 4 times. In our prompt, we ask for sales for a given month. In order to display the shortened name of the month, we use our month array. Using our counter K is an index to display that month. And then we add the data that the user gives us into that array, and then we print it at the end. So cool, we have some good examples there. That's what we were wanting, some good code examples. And this one is pretty complicated because we're accessing a couple of arrays simultaneously. But what if we want to go a little bit further? We've got a lot of this code already written. This is from the PowerPoint from our textbook, and they have this example, and this is to find the best salesman. So we're going to allow users to enter salesmen's names or salesperson's names and their sales amount. We have a couple of variables here that we're going to use to determine who had, I guess, the best sales. We're going to set up a prompt asking for the salesperson's name and monthly sales. And we're going to ask them to type in a star or a 0 when they're done. Excuse me. Remember, that's called a sentinel character that we want to stop our input loop when someone types in that character. We're going to read in the name and sales for the person. We're going to make ours 2 separate ones, right? Because it's kind of messy reading in a string and a number. Now, as long as they enter in some data, we're going to update our max if necessary. Is this sales amount bigger than the maximum sales amount in our array? We're going to have to see how we can figure that one out. And then irregardless of whether it's a bigger amount than the maximum we've seen so far or not, we're going to increment our counter and execute our loop again, asking for another salesman name and sales amount. Finally, at the end, we're going to write out the maximum sales for the month and who that salesperson was. So this one is a little bit more involved than those ones we were doing last time. Let's see if we can step it up a notch here. I'm going to move this over to the side, but we'll be referring to it. I'd like to create a new Python source code file, but I'm so lazy. I don't know. I'd like to copy this month array. We don't really need it for this one. So let's just create a new file. I've got my menu kind of hidden here. So I'm going to use my file menu to create a new file. And I want to name this one so let me save it. Have me in the right place. I'll get to the right place. And this is going to be Chapter 7, parallel arrays. And we'll go ahead and say this is the salesman array dot py. So I want to add some information. date today. April is almost over, huh? I don't think I've left the house except to go out in the yard. Ugh. So the top sales, that's adding a little bit of an interesting twist for us. Whoops, and I want that to be on the new line, it doesn't matter. Okay. So we know that, like they said, we're gonna need an array to hold the names. And we're gonna need an array to hold the sales. So as we add a name to our name array, we want to add an amount to our sales array. What did it autocorrect? Oh, oh my goodness. Is it gonna do it again? I didn't notice it. Scary stuff, huh? Ignoring that and continuing on. We're going to set up a variable to be our maximum sales also. And they start with it equals 0. And that kind of means that very first one we read is probably going to become the maximum, right? It's going to be greater than that because we're starting with it at 0. It's not wrong. I don't know. You haven't heard all of those old end time stories, huh? We won't go there. Okay, so in our application here, I'm going to go ahead and add a variable to be our sentinel. Because we want it to be a star. You know, we like having those defined. That's when we're going to end this loop, right? So they want us to input some data. Let's start out with we're going to have to control our loop ourselves. So they have K again as an index. We're going to set it equal to 0. We're not going to use a for loop, so we're going to have to control that variable's value ourselves, where if we were able to use a for loop, we could have the for loop control it. Why can we not use a for loop in this situation? Because we don't know how many times they want to enter names and sales. We use for loops when we know how many times, when there's a certain number of times. But when we're not sure, we need to use a while loop. So before we go into our while loop, we're going to prompt our users for an initial value. This is called a priming read. That means we're going to read before we start a loop. And we want to read in, first of all, something into our names array. So we're going to append to our names array. What are we going to append? Well, whatever we receive as input, and our prompt is going to say, enter a sales person's name. And then I'm going to put the star when done. We have a period. Okay, so our prompt is going to be enter a salesperson's name, star when done. We're using that for our input statement. whatever they input, then we will append to our list. So we want our while loop to run, and we're going to say while the last names thing is like not equal to the star. Well, if we just did an append, we don't really know which one to look at, right? How do we know? Well, we can look at our names array and we can see how many entries it has. So we could figure that out. Let's set up a k to be equal to that. We're going to say instead of being equal to 0, we want k to be equal to the length of our names array, the size. How do we figure that out? Let's Google it. Python array length. That seems good. Let's see, I'm going to look, you know, my Googling here. I am successful if I don't have to actually click on anything. And here's one. Use of len function to achieve this, in case I forgot. So I can say that I want the length of my array. The len function, though, works a little differently. Instead of saying name.length, I'm going to say I want the len of my names array. And we're going to go put that in our syntax guide in just a moment and clarify why that's different. Now, if the length of my array is 3, then to access the last entry in my array, my index value should be 2. So I need to subtract 1 from the total length of the array to get the index value of the last entry. Right? Because he's 1 less than the length of the array because 0 counts. Okay, so finally, I'm ready here. Now I know which entry they added, or at least I know its index value. So I can say while that entry names at position k is not equal to that star. I can continue my loop. Now, the first thing in my loop, in our example, they prompted for the salesman person's name and the sales amount in the same input statement. We decided that would be kind of messy with Python. We could do it, but it wouldn't necessarily be as easy as we want since we're using our array append function. So we're splitting that apart, and we have a separate entry for the sales amount. So we're ready to do that now. We know we have a salesperson's name, so let's append, and we need to make this into a float value, whatever they give us, and we're going to use our input statement to prompt for the monthly sales. So we could say, what was, and we could use our name array, names at position k. So what were their monthly sales? And we're only doing this like for 1 month, but several people. Okay, so like we're doing July's. We're finding the top salesperson for that particular month. All right, so we just said, what was Joe's monthly sales? Change whatever they type into a float and add it to our sales array. Now we have an entry in our names array and our sales array that match. They're parallel to each other, right? We've got to keep them in sync. So let's see if this new entry, the sales at position K, is it greater than our max sales variable? Well, this first time through, we know it is unless they type 0, right? Because right now our max sales variable is set to 0. Well, if this one is greater, let's update our max sales and set it equal to the sales amount we just received. Now, we should be able to update our value of K. We don't need to re-access the length variable or anything like that to get it. We know what's going on, but we don't want it to be within our if statement. So we need to make sure we back tab so that we're not indented in our if statement body, and then we can update the value of K. K now equals K plus 1. Let's go ahead and ask for a new name. I'm going to copy this line, paste it, and that's going to be the end of my while loop. So they'll type in a name, it'll check to make sure that the name they typed in is not a star. It'll execute the loop again, asking for the sales amount. If the sales amount is greater than our max, we'll update our maximum, and we'll add one to K, adding in another salesperson's name. All right. Now, some things about this. If, when we get done, we're going to end up with a star in our names array, right? It's going to be the last entry because we're just taking whatever they type in and putting it straight into our array. So that's okay. Just be aware, that that's a consideration we're going to have to make. So we're done with our loop. Let's back tab.
I have a kind of odd question.
Uh-huh.
Or I guess a slightly off-topic question. And we don't have to do it. Just so let's say we also want to know what the team did. Would it simply be would it be as simple as importing math and then just saying average and then putting in names array at the end of it? More specifically,
Yeah.
could you use the name of the array? Well, yeah, I guess you could, because it's kind of its point, as that list of floats.
We should be able to. So let's output a lot of that different information here because we've got quite a bit. So let's see what we can get. They want to know the maximum. So let's print it out first. And honestly, we could probably just use an array function to find that out without us having to do this logic. So sometimes Python makes it like too easy. We can't learn the concepts. But we want to print out, first of all, the maximum. So our maximum sales for the month. We need to convert that to a string and print out our max sales variable. And then the next thing we want us to print is who was that salesperson? Do we have that data? How do we know which salesperson that maximum was? We need a way to save that index, don't we? We do. Let's create another variable. And we'll call it max K. And every time we run our if statement to update our max sales variable, let's update that max K variable so that we're saving K. Then whatever we run into, whatever salesperson we were processing, when we hit that maximum, will remain in our max K variable. So let's use that as the index here to know which salesperson was the maximum seller. Yep, RJ, we probably could use pop. Okay, does it look good? Let's try running it. We don't have any functions, so it's kind of messy. If we had, but that pseudocode that they gave us didn't really have any, so we'd really be, mangling things up if we put functions in, but it would be a lot easier for us to understand. I'm going to go ahead and run it as non-functional as it is. Okay, let's enter a salesperson's name. Julie. What was Julie monthly sales? I've got a spacing issue there, huh? So let's say it was 500. Jose had 2,000. James 400. I'm just going to add. That should be enough. So now we know that the middle one should be the one that is displayed as the maximum sales person. So I'm going to enter my star to stop. Crash. Oh, it just is mad. Why? It says that whenever we tried to print out that salesperson, we didn't convert it to a string. Huh, all of that running for that silly problem. Let's do that. Make it a string. Run it again. Typo again. Okay. So that looks good. It's the right sales, but that's not exactly a salesperson, is it? So I should have noticed that's why we didn't convert it to a string. We should be using our names array, not our sales array. So we don't need to convert it to a string. See, did 12 people say that? No. Good. Names. Just wanted to run this thing 47 times. One more time. Oh, I'm going to fix that other problem. What was their monthly sales? I want a space. And we could even do like a single quote S, right? What was Joe's monthly sales? Then I've got to change it to were, because otherwise it's a tense issue, right? Making me tense. Enter a salesperson's name. Julie. What were Julie's monthly sales? An extra little quote somewhere. 500. 2,000. 400. Star. Okay, so our maximum was 2,000, and that was Joe's. Did it work? Let me show you the code again. Any problems that we need to fix before we try some other great things here? Working for everybody? Let's put some additional print statements in and see some of the things that Sunny was talking about. We have so many resources available to us when we're working with arrays. So could we print out the maximum sales without keeping track of that? Let's try it. Sales from the array. So we could say sales dot what? Let's go look. I'm going to bring up Google and I'm going to search for Python array functions. We have a lot of different resources available. Let's look at this W3 Schools one. Their stuff is really good, and they have a lot of new Python stuff that they didn't used to have, even some little examples and some little problems that you can try, little try it yourself things. That's kind of new. So there's the append function. Here's that pop function that RJ was mentioning. If we used it to get rid of that star, we would have to find out the length of our array, or we could use the remove function too. Or we could remove something that has a specific value. So that would be a good way maybe to remove that star without having to do any additional processing. They give us a nice list of some array methods too. So they say besides removing, we could count how many entries we have. So that would sort of be like our length. We could clear the entries. We could copy the whole list, sort it, reverse it. So we can do a lot of different things. Still not giving us our average though. And I think we can do that. So I want to keep this W3 Schools one open because I like that nice list. But I'm going to open a new tab and search again. Python array AVG. Let's try it. Let's find the average of a list. Oh, that's good. So they say, well, you can't exactly use a function named average to get that information. But what you could do is use this function called sum and then use the length function. So the sum function would give us the sum of all of the entries in the list or array, and then the length function tells us how many there were, so we can use that as a divisor to get our average. So let's put that in our application. I wanted to do maximum first, so I'm going to keep that. Let's do Python list. I keep saying array, and if you notice, Python likes the word list. Okay, and sure enough, there is a max method. It says there's a max method and min method to find the maximum and the minimum in a list or array. So let's do that one first. Let's see if that works right. I think I need one more parenthesis there. Okay, that looks good. I got the little underlines there where they're matching up. it's less distracting than Idle's thing of highlighting them all, but it's a little harder to see. So I'm going to try running this now. We should end up with the same value. Yep, so when we did the maximum and we added logic to calculate and keep track of the maximum amount, we got $2,000. When we used the max function with our sales list, we got that 2,000. What's the difference? We don't know what position this 2,000 is in, so we can't go back and say who that salesperson was, because remember, we're using these arrays in parallel, these lists in parallel, so Python doesn't know they're related at all. That relationship is just for us. So we don't have any way to know which entry that is. Is it entry number, index number 3, 7? Now, we could search through the array for that amount and find it again to get that entry. So it's not like we would never be able to get it. But notice how we don't have that piece of information available to us. All right, so then let's try our average. I'll create a variable, and we're going to set our average equal to sum of all of the items in our sales list divided by the length of all of the items in our sales list. And then we can print out that average. Let's try it. And start. That looks about right for the numbers that I put in. So we were able to get that pretty quickly. And there's so many different things we can do. Now, if we need to keep track ourselves, we could set up a variable and just add the sales amount to that variable each time our loop is executed. So we could control that ourselves too. Questions? Is it working? Oh, let's add one more thing or two. So here's our entire names array. And then underneath that, let's print out our entire sales array. So we can see what they look like. And then there's so many different options we had, but in our names array, let's remove the entry that has the star. And then print it again. I'm going to copy those 2 lines. So we can see if our star entry is indeed removed. Let's try it. Put my star in. here's our entire names array, Julie, Jose, and Bob, and our star. And we can see right away our parallel arrays are kind of screwed up, aren't they? Because we have this extra entry. So they're not completely parallel. But after we take that star and remove it, now our names array looks good and it matches the sales array. So that can be a little detail that we don't even notice until we're way testing and cause trouble. So easy enough to fix. So as we go through, let's add a few comments here. We have our array of salesperson names, our array of sales amounts, and I should make that say list. Try to use the correct terminology for the language. Now our max sales is going to be variable for the top sales. Our sentinel is our character and our loop. A is our index variable, and max K used to hold index of max scales. So we can refer to our names array, right?
Can you go back down to the remove line?
Uh-huh. And this is a good spot for us. So let's looking at our Word document. We have these two different ways that we can do things when we're working with an array. There are other ways too, but those two ways are important. So first of all, we have the type of syntax where we have the array name followed by a dot, followed by a function name. Did I get quiet? Or is it RJ? Anybody else having audio?
Sounds fine to me.
Okay,
No,
good.
I can hear you just fine.
You can hear okay? I think it's you, RJ. His speakers just went. Time for electronics. So when we're using this type of syntax, we are using a function within the array class. The array class basically means that there is a library of things that work with arrays. We've seen libraries of things that give us math functions. We've seen a library that gives us random functions. When we're working with arrays, we actually have a separate library like that, but it's included in the standard Python files. So we're really saying that append is part of the array class. I'm going to make array in uppercase, or let's say list. So it is a function that is within that library. And that library is included for us, so we don't have to worry about it. But that's why the syntax is the way it is. Now let's add another line here. And let's say we're doing the syntax where we call the length function. And make the L lowercase. And I'm going to make the len keyword, the blue. Because now in this case, length, len, is a built-in function that expects an array as a parameter. So it's just the way the code is written. And how do we know the difference? Do we know if append is an array function or a system function? They're both built-in functions that are available to us, but it makes a difference how we type the code as to where that function comes from. You know, is it part of the system? Is it a built-in function? Or is it part of our array library? The only way we can know for sure is to have sample code or search, do a Google search to find out. We could try both ways, but then we could, you know, try till the end of time, depending on where our function name is and all those kinds of things. So go ahead.
So built-in functions are in Python are going to be written using Python logic and syntax, correct?
They could be, right? They could be written in some other language too.
Okay, well, if it's written in Python, I would say that they are, sorry, I would say that at least for length, with what we've learned, is going to be the same built-in function. It's just going to be a parameter of length itself, where it checks to see what it's checking the length of. You know, is it
right
string? Is it an integer? Is it we're not calling them arrays, we're calling them lists. Is it a list?
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, so if then else statements. But that's just logical deduction.
Right.
Lost my word. It's a guess.
Uh-huh. No, it's a perfectly good guess. It's pretty valid. I'm going to change all of these. Let's select it all. I want to select my table here. And if you do, so Control F to bring up the find function. Where am I? I will just do replace. And I want to replace array with list. And I'm going to replace one at a time, and only in my selection. It's not going to let me do that. So I'm just going to find the next one and replace it. And I'll keep replacing. Because the word is list for Python. Now, I think I've used that array. I'm going to say no there. That's all of them. Okay, did you see that? So I selected our table here. I used replace on the home ribbon and replaced the term array with the term list so that it would be more accurate for our Python language. Remember, our Prelude to Programming textbook is talking about language independence, like topics that are independent of a specific language. So array is the more general term, but when we are working with Python, an array is referred to as a list. So these functions that are specified with a dot following the array name are functions that exist only for arrays, and those system functions that exist, like they were saying, for integers and other types of data, are our built-in system functions. But there's no problem in searching Google to see which way it is for a specific thing that you want to do. Okay, if that one's working for everybody, let's make sure everybody's got it. We see a few other functions and things that we can use. And I think that you see this right away, that if we were working with our salesman's amount information and we tried to keep track of variables for each data item that was entered for us, it would be just impossible. You know, we don't even know how many salespeople they were going to enter. So how would we set up variables to keep track of all of those? It would be really, really hard. And so using a list or an array adds to our flexibility. They just save a huge amount of time and effort. It's kind of like using a function. If we have to repeat something, it is a whole lot more effort to duplicate that code than it is to set it up as a function and just call it again. Let's look at this code. What is going on here? I'm going to give you a second to look at it. Let's say doing a lot of things that we were doing in our last program, right? Prompting for input, but we're just asking for scores. Every time we get a score, we're adding it to a sum. We saw that we can use that sum function in Python to get that information also. So either way is fine depending on our requirements. After we've got all of the entries, we're calculating an average, which we did in our last example. And then we're setting up to start another loop. And in this loop, we're looking at all the entries that have already been made, right? And we're trying to figure out of the average, which we calculated earlier, how many of the scores are higher than that average. So we set up our if statement to say, if this score is greater than that average that we've already calculated, add one to our counter of scores that are greater than the average. So a lot of similarness and a lot of differences to what we did. Let's look at this next one. Okay, again, take a second, take a look at this pseudocode, and let's see what's going on here. How is this one different than the salesperson's one?
Why is count set set to an integer in the beginning on line 2 when it's going to be a string as soon as you put any actual input into it?
We're not putting the input into count. We're putting the inputs into that.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah,
You
so
see it?
so the count part is just it's our k value. Okay.
Right. Our index value. But that temp name variable, that's what's different than what we did. Why are they using that temp name variable? What's the end goal there? What's that going to achieve that's different than the salesperson's example?
It looks like it keeps the asterisk out of the array.
Exactly. So we're gonna use a temporary variable to hold that name input and test it to make sure that they didn't type in that Sentinel character before we add that name to our list. So a little bit safer, right? That the way that we were doing it was a little haphazard to just throw stuff directly into our list. But it was okay. We figured out something to do about it at the end. Usually better to keep things from happening at the front end than cleaning it up at the tail end. we were kind of tail ending it there. So that's exactly what was going on here. Put it in a temp variable, make sure it's not the star before we add it to our list. Cool. So a little practice, and of course, when you're working with arrays, just like loops and other things, you can always benefit from more practice. You know, anything that you try is going to be helpful to you. Now, they have a little blurb in here about databases, and it's an important point because when we get to looking at lists and arrays, we're actually starting to think about real world data. You know, instead of just typing in 2 numbers at the console and adding them together like we were doing in our very first programs, we're thinking about, oh, in the real world, we're going to have to keep track of a lot of information, not just these few things. So it gets unwieldy quickly. Just like if we tried to think of a way to keep track of variables, to keep track of all of that salesperson's information, can get out of hand. When we work with arrays, and we're working with parallel arrays, same thing. We can quickly create a system that becomes unmanageable. So for the best purposes, we can use a database. And a database is many tables that can be linked in many ways. So kind of like our 2 lists were parallel to each other, databases contain many tables that are related to each other. So we might have a table for a salesperson, and in that table we could keep track of all of the related data about a salesperson, like their name, you know, their phone number, their email address, all of those kinds of things about the salesperson. Then we could have additional tables to keep track of, like each month, maybe July. For salesman person 01, we could have their sales amount, you know, their sales amount so far this year, or did they win the prize, those kinds of pieces of information. Those tables would be related, just like our parallel lists were related, but the database management system would keep track of that relationship for us, so we would just be able to use the data. So we can retrieve information and process it and do it for all of the different things we need to do for our company. Now, whenever we're working with databases, they want us to think about computer game online sales. What is a good place that does things like that? Can you think of any? If you want to think about Steam, what kind of database do they have? Are you out there? Are you in the Steam database? What do they know about you? They know your account name, right? They know your actual name if you've given it to them. Depending on other pieces of information, they may have gathered quite a bit of data about you. So they probably do keep track of what game you play. You know they do, right, when you bring up that main menu to look at things. They know what you've already got. That could be one table, a table of, you know, games that you've already downloaded or that you've played or purchased, or depending on the licensing of the game. Whenever they're looking at lump sum data, we hear that a lot, where we hear that your data, your information will be aggregated and only used in a summary way. Well, that means that we're going to take all of the data from all of these tables and we're going to summarize it so that in the end, nobody knows an individual person's name or an individual person's specific game choice, but we're going to have summary information that knows 5 million people played last week, you know, and we had this kind of response time. Whenever we are looking at this data, we're going to do queries. And a query is like a question. So with the database management system, a query is asking the database a question. And the database always answers with data, with information. So, you know, how many games have over 1 million downloads in X amount of time? We could do that, run that as a query. So yeah, we've got this database, this information for Steam. We can have the front end people that are trying to figure out how to do more ad campaigns. They can use the data. The people that are developing new games can use the data. Are people interested in VR? Seems like they are. Should we do more in that area? Maybe we should. So that all of that information can be gathered from the same database. We don't have to have 50 different arrays or lists or things all over the place that different users are referring to. Okay, so we can do everything that way. All right, so how does that relate to an array? It's basically a collection. They're all collections, data that is going to be maintained in occurrences. You're going to have multiples of the same thing. Now, you guys have seen this already, and I'm kind of bringing it back to you again with our assignment. When we're working with a string, it's really an array. It's an array of characters. So here we have a first name being declared is an array of 15 characters. We would have a very hard time doing that in Python, right? That's happening behind the scenes. When we say variable equals some string, behind the scenes, Python is like, oh, it's a list of characters. I can keep track of that list of characters. I know what to do. So strings are simply lists or arrays of characters. That's why when we use the plus sign to concatenate, we can add strings together. Okay? We've been doing that since the very beginning. We can do that because they're already lists of characters, and we can add them together to make an even bigger list of characters. And then we saw that the len function will work for us on a string, and it'll return to us how many letters are in that string. In this pseudocode, again, take a look at it for a second and see if you can determine what it's doing. Kind of tells you in the title, hint, hint. So here it is. We ask them for a name, a username, and then we find the length of the name that they gave us. And if it is not got any characters or greater than 12, it's invalid. So we're only going to accept it if it is the right length. So we're looking at some sort of username, and we're going to validate that input, making sure that it's the right length. And this should be very similar to the assignment you have. Which part of the string is the first name and which part of the string is the last name? Well, there might be different ways that we could figure that out. In this example, let's see how they're doing it. They ask for the full name, just like your assignment. They decide that the full name is going to be separated into different words based on a space character. They go into a loop and they get the first name getting each letter at a time. 1 letter, 2 letters, 3 letters, 4 letters. Found a space. Oh, stop. Now, that was the first name then. We can do this a lot easier in Python. Then they set up the first initial by getting the first character of the whole name. They set up the last initial by finding the location the first name ended and adding one. And then they go into another loop to get the whole rest of the name. We can do it a lot easier. Let's do it. I'm going to create a new file and save it. And I'm going to call this split strings.py. Now the logic that they show in that pseudocode is very good. And it might be logic that you would have to use in an older language like C# or Java. But we don't have to in Python. So I'm going to start out with a string. Here is a nice sentence. I can actually split this up based on the spaces. And Python has a really nice function to do that. Let's go search. Oh, look, there's a whole bunch. Split string into list, split functions. Well, I think I want to split up this string into list. Now, notice I had to know to search for split, right? Might not be something that would be evident if you didn't have that little bit of background knowledge. But W3 Schools does have information about it, so I might be able to find it pretty easily on their site. Let's take a look at what they say. Oh, here we go. They set up a variable txt, welcome to the jungle, and then they say, set a variable x equal to text.split. Okay, so let's try it like that. Then I'm going to print it. Let's run this. And there is our list. Here, comma, is, comma, a nice sentence. So each of those items are entries in the list, right? Because it just pulled those out. Notice my last one has that dot. So you know I could do it twice, couldn't I? Let's see if I got remove dot equals string one dot split. And then I could say I want to use a dot as my split character. Let's print out that remove dot list. So remove dot gave us 2 entries in our resulting my list array. We had, here's a nice sentence, and then this entry that is something that we don't need, an empty entry, because when it eliminated the dot, it just totally made it an empty entry. Okay, so that's fine. Our remove dot array now has 2 entries, and we have our sentence in the first one. So instead of string 1, I could use my remove dot. Entry at position 0. Vincent, yes. And so splits by default wherever it encounters a space. That's the default. But here we specified that we wanted it to split wherever it found a period character. So we could put any character here that we wanted to do the splitting on. So we're splitting it by the dot, then we're going to take our result and split it by spaces, so that we should end up with just a word in each entry of our my list. Let's run it and see. Sure enough, our first printout, we have the 2 entries eliminating our period, and then our second print, we have each of our words. Now, we could also use a for loop, right? For word in my list, word. And that should print out all of the words in our list in a column. There we go. So here we printed our whole list, and then we go into a for loop to print out each word. Okay, so a lot of information. I know it is. If we want to have more than one dimension to our list, we can create 2-dimensional arrays. As I mentioned, we would just put a comma between the square brackets to indicate it has 2 dimensions. Here's an example where we have scores for students for different tests. So in a 2-dimensional array, we might have test 1, test 2, test 3, test 4. And we know that all of this first row has to do with student 1. That's a structure that we created. Student 2. Now, when we're working with a 2-dimensional array like this, our index becomes row and column. And notice I say row first, because row index comes first, the column index comes second. So if I want to refer to this entry here, this 90, that would be row 0, column what? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that would be 0, 4. We don't work with 2-dimensional arrays often, really, because they're complex, and we can handle this kind of data structure in better ways. And the best way is by using a data file or a database. And that's why next week we'll look at how we can access data files so that we can keep this kind of information in a more manageable format. The examples here take you through some 2-dimensional array logic. They have some good examples using nested loops logic for you to consider. Again, we're getting to the point where their pseudocode syntax is so different than Python's. If you can just remember beginning value, ending value, increment, because that part is the same. And then they have another example to display those contents. So this one is kind of interesting. Student names and scores, so they create that 2-dimensional scores array that they showed in the previous example. Like I said, next time we'll look at using files, and it's a better way for us to handle this kind of data. So we'll focus on that. Anytime you see two-dimensional or above arrays, usually after you've worked with that code for a little while, you'll be thinking, boy, I think there could have been a better way. And there probably is. So sometimes it's necessary, but it's a little too overly complicated to be maintainable. So we like to have things a little simpler. Now, to append something to a two-dimensional array, it's a little different. Let's bring up Adam. Oops. And so I'm going to say array 2D dot append Nancy. Let's see if this works. And then we'll stop for today because we're out of time. We'll do that next time. How's that? I'll save it and we'll get some two-dimensional array stuff going, or I'll send it to you here in a few minutes. I know I've got some code. It's just a little bit different than what I was doing. I'm going to make sure that everything's saved. You guys have all of your stuff today. And yeah, I'll post a little bit of code here in a few minutes after I get that exactly straightened out. So I'm not giving you something that's garbage, making you work right up until the last minute. Keep just cracking that whip at you, and you guys are just doing great. Next week, we'll try to take it slow. We have that one last assignment that's due that is fun for us because we're going to take an image and kind of mess with it a little bit programmatically. So please don't worry about that assignment. If we end up not having time to do it together in class, or if we don't feel like it's something that can be accomplished, then that assignment will be removed. So it is our last one before our final, and we don't want to feel like we're rushing here at the end, so we'll make sure that it's really possible. So that'll be us. So what you should do is practice working with arrays, try some different things to get to feeling more comfortable with them, and use them to practice with looping structures so that you can feel more comfortable with the looping structures also. Any questions before we go? Got it all.
No, thank you.
Thank you, guys. Yay. Okay.
Python calls arrays lists, right? Is there a
Right.
difference between an actual array and a list?
Well, not that I'm aware of. I think the big difference is whenever we say that arrays have to be stored contiguously in memory, because Python uses a more of a list structure, I think they can get away from that requirement so that array entries can be scattered around throughout memory.
So most of the time when I think of arrays, I think of something that can't have any gaps in it. Like it's legitimately
Right.
prevented from doing
Right.
that.
But
Can
so
Python lists have gaps?
they can have gaps because a list structure includes like an embedded, a hidden kind of pointer to the next item in the list, and the previous item in the list. So this is an area where Python would use more resources than using like a native array in C# or C++, but you also benefit from that flexibility of memory allocation and those kinds of things. So it is doing it a little differently behind the scenes. And in C#2 and Java 2, when they talk about linked lists, is when all of that finally comes out. Oh, can see it. So they're just using a more advanced structure internally. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does. Can't wait to start going into. Does Python call databases tables or something, or vice versa? I think there's being arrays and tables, but
Tables are an individual entity within a database, and it is very related to an array,
okay.
logically. So when we think about it, it can kind of be thought about almost in the same way. So just a different structure for us to use to store our data. Anybody else? Awesome. I'll see you next week. I'm going to shut this down. Have a great weekend.
You too. Bye.
Thanks.